8 months ago, this spot was a flat patch of dirt with a pile of logs on it and a stack of receipts I was almost afraid to add up. There was a fire pit, a tarp strung between two trees for shade, and a whole lot of standing timber that hadn't been touched yet. Today I'm standing inside a finished cabin with a roof over my head, lights that turn on, and a number at the bottom of that receipt pile that came in at less than half of what the first contractor bid quoted me for the exact same footprint. That gap between what I was quoted and what I actually spent is the whole reason for this video, so let's get into it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because I get into this kind of real, no-nonsense, off-grid building pretty regularly. I want to start with the number that got this whole project moving, because it's the number that convinces most people to just buy a prefab kit or hand the whole thing to a contractor and write a much bigger check without ever really pricing out the alternative. A contractor-built cabin this size, roughly 600 square feet, was coming in somewhere between $100 and $175 a square foot around here once you factor labor, materials, and the contractor's markup on top of it, which by itself usually runs somewhere around 20% of the whole project cost before a single nail gets driven. Run that math and you're looking at $60,000 to $100,000 for something not much bigger than a two-car garage, which is a genuinely hard number to swallow before you've laid a single board. I didn't have that kind of money sitting around, and even if I did, I don't think I'd have wanted to spend it that way. What I had instead was land, a chainsaw, a sawmill I already owned for other projects, and more weekends than I probably should admit to on camera. Before any of that could happen, though, there was the part nobody puts in the highlight reel, which is just getting a flat, buildable pad out of a piece of ground that had never been anything but forest floor. I didn't hire an excavator for this, mostly out of stubbornness, and partly because getting one down that same rutted track that ruled out the concrete truck would have been its own headache entirely. I did it with a tractor I already owned, a box blade, and more hours than I want to admit fighting roots that didn't want to let go of the ground they'd been sitting in for decades. There was one stump in particular, dead center of where the pad needed to be. That took me the better part of an entire evening to finally work loose, and by the end of it I'm fairly sure that stump and I had developed a genuine personal rivalry that neither of us was willing to back down from first. If you're pricing this out for your own place, site prep is one of those line items that's easy to forget about entirely until you're standing there with a shovel realizing the ground isn't nearly as flat as it looked from the truck window. Foundation was the next decision, and it's the one I see people get wrong the most when they're planning something like this on a piece of ground that isn't right off a paved road. The default answer everybody gives you is pour a slab, and a slab foundation genuinely is one of the cheaper options on paper, but that math only holds up if a concrete truck can actually get to your site. Mine can't. The last quarter mile in here is a rutted-out track that a loaded mixer truck has no business attempting, especially after a rain, and I wasn't about to build a road just to build a foundation. That ruled concrete out for me before cost ever entered the conversation. What I went with instead was helical piers, which are basically big steel screws that get driven into the ground with a hydraulic drive head instead of dug and poured, and the appeal for a site like mine is obvious once you think about it. No excavation, no forms, no waiting on concrete to cure, no truck required at all beyond something to haul the piers themselves in. They cost more per pier than a basic concrete footing does, sometimes considerably more depending on soil and depth, but once you add up what I would have spent building or renting equipment to punch a road in here just to get concrete on site, the piers came out ahead, and they went in over a weekend instead of over a week and a half of waiting on weather and cure time. Watching that first pier go in was honestly one of the more satisfying parts of the whole project, this steel screw just biting into the ground and disappearing inch by inch under its own torque. No digging, no mess, no waiting around for anything to set. Rented the drive head, borrowed a friend's tractor with enough hydraulic flow to run it, and had all 6 piers in the ground and leveled off in a single long Saturday. Framing is where the real savings started stacking up, and this is the part a lot of you have been asking about since that lumber video. I milled every stick of framing lumber on this cabin myself, off Douglas fir I'd already had down from thinning a section of my own property that needed it anyway. Retail dimensional lumber around here has been running close to $1 a board foot for standard construction grade, and a cabin this size eats up somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000 board feet, once you count studs, plates, rafters, and blocking. Do that math at retail and you're at $3,000 to $4,000 just for the framing lumber before you've bought a single sheet of sheathing. Milling it myself, once you count fuel, blades, and the wear and tear on the mill, I came in at something closer to a third of that, which lines up almost exactly with what I've seen other guys with sawmills report when they actually track their real numbers instead of just assuming it's cheaper. I want to be straight about the trade-off here too, because I don't want to oversell it. That lumber isn't grade stamped. Nobody official came out and certified it structural grade the way a lumberyard 2x6 is certified before it ever leaves the mill. For a lot of the framing on a simple code light structure like this, I'm comfortable with that because I know exactly what tree it came from and exactly how it was cut and dried. If you're building somewhere with a strict inspection process that requires stamped lumber for structural framing, this particular shortcut might not be available to you the way it was for me, and that's worth knowing before you get your heart set on it. Roofing, windows, and doors were the one category where I didn't fight the retail system much, and I want to explain why, because it ties into that same honesty about where DIY savings actually make sense versus where they don't. I can mill a stud. I cannot manufacture a double-pane window that won't fog up or leak in 5 years, and I'm not about to learn glazing on a structure I plan on living in through a real winter. Same logic applied to the metal roofing. I put it on myself, which saved the labor cost of a roofing crew, but I bought the actual panels retail because a mistake in a homemade roofing material shows up as a leak over your bed at 2 in the morning. And that's not a lesson I wanted to learn the expensive way twice. Installing it myself instead of hiring a crew probably saved me somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 in labor alone, and it cost me a sunburn, a couple of scraped knuckles, and one memorable afternoon where a gust of wind nearly turned a full sheet of roofing into a very expensive kite. Comment down below if you've got access to your own logs or a local sawyer, because I'm curious how many of you could pull off something similar versus how many of you are stuck buying retail no matter what. Even a small sawmill, the kind that mounts on a chainsaw bar instead of the bigger bandsaw setup I run, can make a real dent in a framing budget if you've got any standing timber worth cutting on your own property already. Now, the part I really don't want to skip past because I've seen enough off-grid content out there make this sound like a total free-for-all, and it just isn't one. Off-grid does not mean permit-free, and anybody telling you otherwise is setting you up for a bad afternoon with the county down the road. Most rural counties still require a permit for any structure over a certain size, and even where the structure itself might slide under some small building exemption, the systems attached to it, well, septic and often electrical, usually don't get the same pass. I made one phone call to the planning department before I ever cut a log for this build, and that one call told me exactly what I could build without a permit, what needed one, and what would need an inspection regardless of how far off the grid I thought I was living. Turned out my county has a small structure exemption for anything under a certain square footage that isn't intended as a permanent dwelling, which covered the shell of the cabin itself, but the electrical hookup and the septic system I put in still needed their own separate permits and their own separate inspections regardless of that exemption. That distinction surprised me a little, honestly. I'd assumed if the building itself was exempt, everything attached to it would be too, and that assumption would have been an expensive one to act on without checking first. It cost me nothing but 20 minutes on the phone, and it saved me from finding any of that out the hard way after the cabin was already standing, which is a genuinely expensive way to learn a lesson. That honesty extends to what I actually did myself versus what I paid somebody else to do, because the DIY saving story only holds together if I'm straight with you about where it stops. I pulled every foot of low-voltage wiring in this cabin myself, the lighting circuits, the outlets feeding off the battery bank, all the stuff running off the solar and hydro systems I've talked about in other videos. What I did not do myself was the main electrical panel and the connection point where everything ties together, because that's exactly the spot where a mistake doesn't just cost you money. It can genuinely burn a building down or hurt somebody. And it's also exactly the spot a lot of jurisdictions require a licensed electrician to sign off on regardless of how far off grid you are. I paid for that, gladly, and I'd tell anybody watching this to do the same. Same story with the well. I can run a chainsaw and a sawmill all day long, but I do not own a drill rig. And drilling my own well was never a realistic line item on this budget, no matter how much sweat equity I was willing to put in. Insulation and the interior finish work is where most of my actual weekends disappeared, and it's also the least glamorous part of this whole build by a wide margin. Nobody's making a highlight reel out of stapling bats into wall cavities or cutting tongue-and-groove boards to fit around a window opening that wasn't quite as square as I'd promised myself it was. I did all of it myself, partly to save money and partly because I wanted to know exactly how every wall in this place was put together in case I ever need to open one back up. The wood paneling on the walls came off the same mill as the framing lumber, different boards, thinner stock, but same source, which meant the interior finish cost me almost nothing beyond my own time once the framing lumber savings were already banked. I did buy the insulation retail, no way around that one either. Fiberglass bats sized to fit the stud bays I'd already built. And I'll admit I spent more evenings than I'd like measuring and remeasuring gaps around outlet boxes than I ever expected insulation to require. The power running through those outlet boxes ties back to a couple of other projects I've shown you already. The small solar setup and the hydro turbine I built off the water system running through this property. I'm not going to walk back through all of that here since I've already covered it in detail elsewhere, but it's worth mentioning because it's part of the same savings story. A grid connection out here, if the power company would even run a line this far back, would have cost more by itself than the entire cabin build did. Going off-grid from day one wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was another line item that stayed off the budget entirely because I'd already built the power system before I ever framed the first wall. Let's actually tally this up, because I think the number means more than me just saying it was cheaper, and I'd rather show you the actual categories than just hand you one big impressive total with nothing behind it. Foundation, the helical piers plus the equipment rental to drive them, ran me right around $4,000. Framing lumber milled myself somewhere around $1,100 once I counted fuel and blade wear against what the same board footage would have cost at the yard. Roofing, windows, and doors I bought retail, no way around that one, and that ran close to $9,000 between the three of them. Insulation, interior finish work, all the stuff I did myself over a lot of evenings and weekends, somewhere around $3,800 in materials. Electrical panel and hookup, the one big labor cost I paid for outright, came to just under $3,000 once permits, and the inspection fee got folded in. Septic permitting, and the system itself, since we're being honest about every line item here, added another $2,800, and that's a number I've seen plenty of people leave out of their own build breakdowns entirely, which always struck me as a strange thing to skip. Add up everything else, hardware, fasteners, the small stuff that never makes it into anybody's highlight reel but adds up fast anyway, and I landed at right around $24,000 total against a low-end contractor bid of $60,000 for the same footprint. That's not a rounding error, that's most of a used truck sitting in the difference. What that number doesn't show you is the other side of the ledger, which is time, and I think it's dishonest to leave that part out just because it makes for a less dramatic thumbnail. This took me the better part of 8 months of weekends and a few stretches of vacation time I burned specifically to push through framing and roofing before the fall rains showed up. A contractor crew could have had the shell up in a couple of weeks with the right manpower. I don't have a crew. I have myself, occasionally a buddy who owes me a favor, and whatever daylight is left after a normal work week. If your time is worth more to you sitting at a desk than it is standing on a roof, this math changes fast, and it's worth doing that calculation honestly before you commit to a project like this instead of after you're 3 months in and exhausted. There's a version of this video that just shows you pretty drone shots of a finished cabin and tells you how much money I saved without any of the boring parts in between, and I think that version does people a disservice because it sets up an expectation that doesn't survive contact with an actual build. I made mistakes on this one. I framed one wall out of square early on and didn't catch it until the sheathing wouldn't sit right, which cost me most of a Saturday pulling nails and doing it over. I underestimated how much roofing underlayment I needed by a wide enough margin that I made an unplanned trip to town in the middle of a job I really didn't want to stop halfway through. I also, and I'll admit this one a little more reluctantly, milled an entire stack of rafters about 3/4 of an inch narrower than I needed because I was working off a plan I'd sketched on the back of a feed store receipt instead of an actual set of drawings. and didn't catch the error until I was standing there trying to figure out why the ridgeline looked wrong from 20 feet away. None of that shows up in a cost breakdown, but all of it is part of what it actually costs to build something yourself, in time and patience, if not always in dollars. I also want to talk about the stretch in the middle of this project where I genuinely considered quitting and just calling a contractor after all, because I think that part gets left out of most of these build videos too. Somewhere around month 4, deep into insulation with the days getting shorter and the enthusiasm from the framing stage long since worn off, I sat in the truck one evening doing the math on how much a contractor would charge just to finish what I had left, and for about 20 minutes that number looked genuinely tempting. What talked me out of it wasn't stubbornness so much as knowing I'd already banked most of the big savings on the structural side, and paying somebody else to do the easier interior work at that point would have meant giving away money I'd already worked hard to save on the harder stuff. If you find yourself at that same low point partway through your own build, that's the math worth doing before you pick up the phone, not just how tired you are that particular week. My dad's got a saying he picked up from an old forester a long time back. It takes wood to grow wood, meaning you need something substantial already established before you can build something bigger off of it. I think there's a version of that same idea buried in this whole project. I didn't start this cabin from nothing. I started it with years of already knowing how to run a chainsaw, already owning a mill, already having spent enough time on this land to know where the good timber was and where the water table sat and which corner of the property actually got sun in the winter. Someone starting completely from scratch, no tools, no land knowledge, no prior experience, is not going to hit the same numbers I hit here. And I'd rather tell you that straight than have you assume this is a formula anybody can just copy and paste onto their own situation. If you're starting further back than I was, that's not a reason not to try. It just means your own version of this timeline probably runs longer, and your own version of the budget probably needs a bigger cushion built in for the tools and the knowledge you'll be picking up along the way instead of already having in hand. What I can tell you is that almost every dollar I saved traces back to one of two things: cutting out a middleman somewhere in the supply chain or substituting my own time for somebody else's labor rate. The lumber savings came from cutting out the sawmill's markup and the retailer's markup both at once. The foundation savings came from picking the method that actually fit my access instead of defaulting to whatever's most familiar. Every dollar I didn't save came from exactly the places where cutting corners would have actually been dangerous or illegal: the panel, the inspection, the well. That's not a complicated formula, but it's one that actually holds up, which is more than I can say for a lot of the wildly optimistic build cost numbers that get thrown around in this corner of the internet. I think a lot of those numbers get inflated, honestly. Not out of malice, but just out of people forgetting what actually went into their own build by the time they sit down to make a video about it. It's easy to remember the big satisfying wins, the lumber you milled for a third of retail, the foundation that came in under budget, and just as easy to quietly forget the unplanned trip to town, the wall you had to reframe, the afternoon you lost to a project that had nothing to do with the cabin at all, but had to happen anyway, because that's just how a piece of property works. I tried to keep every receipt this time specifically, so I wouldn't be tempted to do that same thing to you. I'll get a proper full cost spreadsheet up somewhere for anybody who wants the receipts instead of just my word for it, because I think showing the actual numbers matters more than just claiming a big savings and moving on to the next shot. For now, if you're sitting on land and staring down a contractor quote that's making your stomach turn, it's worth asking yourself the same two questions I had to ask myself here. What can you genuinely do yourself without cutting a corner that could hurt somebody, and where does that line actually sit for your own skills, not somebody else's? Get honest answers to those two questions before you pour a single foundation, and you might find the gap between the quote and the real number is bigger than you think. It won't be free, and it won't be fast. But standing inside a place you built mostly with your own hands hits different than standing inside one you just wrote a check for. And that's worth something too, even if it never shows up on any of these spreadsheets. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.